So hello to all. Welcome to all the participants. Thank you for joining us online today. No matter what time zone you're joining us from. We have quite an international audience from the registration list as well as panelists. So welcome to all the panelists as well. My name is Catherine Sinclair. I am the Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Ottawa Art Gallery in Ottawa, Ontario in Canada. And today, just to explain how the format will go, we're going to have some questions directly to the panelists and have discussion amongst ourselves for approximately 50 minutes and then leave room for audience questions at the end. You can also feel free, of course, to submit your own questions as we go through the chat function, and I will see them as we're going and do my best to potentially incorporate them as we go in the conversation, but also save as many as we can until the end. And so I'll just begin by introducing our topic this morning. So I have had the pleasure of working with my fellow AAMC Foundation Engagement Program for International Curator awardees. So I was one of these. Sarah Ann Lee, he was curator of the Royal Academy of Arts, London, UK, and Laurence Schmidlin, curator at the Musée Cantonal des Beaux-Arts de Lausanne in Switzerland. So the three of us worked together this past year to come up with this webinar topic and to present this to you today. We were all part of this program that was sponsored by the Terra Foundation through the AAMC. I wanted to just mention that I know, speaking for myself, it was a wonderful experience. Over the last 2 years, having this fellowship and enabling me to make some connections internationally, as is indicative today, as well as in the United States on a professional networking level. Applications are actually due Thursday, October 24th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time for this exact same program. And so if you are an international curator, we would encourage you to apply, as it's a really interesting experience. While Sarah and Laurence and I were sitting together this past May at the last conference, we were discussing what we should do for this webinar topic. And we realized in conversation that all three of us were either just through or in the middle of building projects. And that we're from 3 different countries, and this is clearly ubiquitous across the globe. At this point, we're in a phase of museum building. And as we are all 3 in the curatorial role, but we felt that it was something worth discussing, our experiences, the challenges, the opportunities that building projects can create when you're working as a museum professional, and that it would be very valuable to bring together panelists today, who you see here, who have had experiences in various roles across their institutions or involved in museological projects, on reflecting on these types of experiences. So just very briefly, actually Laurence just opened her brand new building last week in Lausanne, Switzerland, which there was an article about that. It's wonderful. And Sarah dealt with the Royal Academy in London's launch of a major new addition and renovation to its original heritage structure in May 2018. And myself, the Ottawa Art Gallery actually opened a brand new purpose-built facility in April 2018 after a 15-year campaign. So I was working with the team to develop and lead the development of the inaugural exhibition and we worked on that over a 5-year period. And so now I'm sort of 18 months out from the opening of the new building, as is Sarah, and there's a lot of time to reflect on staff adjustments, building adjustments, the exhibition schedule, funding adjustments, all kinds of things like that. So we'll speak to some of these issues today, bringing in, of course, our panelists. So I think potentially coming out of the sort of stark architecture phase of the 1990s in terms of museum building, we're now seem to be in a period in many of our experiences, although they're different across the globe, of sort of P3 or public-private partnership and densification projects in terms of museums, where often museums, this is our experience with the Ottawa Art Gallery, are seen as part of an urban renewal, as part of an anchor site for urban renewal, and ways in which we can create more living institutions that are more connected with community. These are often the driving factors in buildings, creating these new institutions. Where we're supposed to have more access to community, better access to technology, more access to collections, and basically, in a sense, better capabilities to engage with objects, experiences, and in a very digital world, more analog experiences of face-to-face interaction, and museums become these community spaces. So without further ado, I will introduce our four speakers today. So I would ask you actually to visit artcurators.org for their full bios, the profile of our webinar today. But just very briefly, I will just say who we have, and then I'll let you panelists speak to your own experiences. So we have Paul Choi, who is project architect for Morphosis in Los Angeles, California. So Paul's going to bring to us the architectural perspective on things. We have Sandra Kiesters, Head of Collections and Research from the Museum Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. We have Leah Lembeck, Department Head of European Painting and Sculpture and American Art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in California. And we have Sophie Lévy, Director and Chief Curator at the Musée d'Art de Nantes in France. And so welcome to each of you. Thank you so much for being here. So first, I think I will invite each of the speakers, and perhaps we can start with you, Paul, to actually just speak to your own, who you are, your role in your institution, a little bit about the nature of your institution and the nature of the building project you're currently on or have been involved with, and what your role in that capacity was. So perhaps we'll start with you, Paul.
Sure. Yeah. So I, unlike most of you, am an architect, and I've been with Morphosis for almost 10 years, and we're currently working on the design of the Korean American National Museum, and that's going to be in the heart of Koreatown, Los Angeles. And that is a museum that will be built for the Korean American community to showcase their history and accomplishments. I've also worked on previous museum projects with Morphosis, including the Museum of Nature and Science in Dallas, Texas, which was opened in 2013, and the Orange County Museum of Art, which has just begun construction in Costa Mesa here in California. And so we do buildings that span a range of typologies, but we also love the museum typology as well.
Thank you. Sandra?
Hello, I'm Sandra Kiesters. I work for Museum Boijmans van Beuningen as a head of collections and research. And Museum Boijmans van Beuningen has a very broad art collection, but also applied arts from the Middle Ages up to the present. We had a lot of trouble with our storerooms in the last 10-15 years, and we've been lobbying to build a new depot. But the idea from the beginning on was to make it publicly accessible. So instead of building it in the outskirts of the city, we are realizing it next to the museum, where we hope to receive between 100,000 and 300,000 visitors a year. So it's been a beautifully designed building, not particularly easy for storing art collections, but intended to receive a lot of visitors as well. We've been working on it quite some time. It's about to be finished next year and to open in 2021. But in the meantime, our museum needed large-scale refurbishment, so we actually left the museum building this May for a large-scale renovation of the monument and to make some adjustments. So we're in all over building projects at the moment.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Leah, would you like to speak to yours? You're just on mute. Just take yours.
Sorry.
Okay, perfect.
Good morning, everybody. I was saying it's morning here in Los Angeles, where I realize it's afternoon and evening everywhere else. My name is Leah Lembeck, and I am a curator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and we are actually, I think, the earliest in the process of all of the panelists. Right now, many of you have already completed or just completed your projects. We are instead about 4 years out of an opening, and so we're in a different position. But our building, our museum itself, if you don't know much about LACMA, is an encyclopedic institution. It's the largest in the Western United States, covers about 6,000 years of art, and with art that spans the globe. We have 13 departments here, which oversee about 135,000 permanent collection objects, and we are looking to replace, or what we are actually building is not an entire new museum, but we're replacing our permanent collection buildings. In the last 10 years or so, we did an expansion of our space, which will remain open during construction. And the new building is actually intended to replace the permanent historical collections. So we are thinking about how the permanent collection can be installed in a way that's more collaborative, for example, with less silos. Again, we have 13 departments here, which have traditionally worked in their own sets of galleries, which is something we're looking to change when the new building opens. And while I'm the curatorial representative on the internal design team that sort of helped set the program over the last couple of years with the architect, I think what's more important for this discussion today is that I'm simply a member of this curatorial team that's thinking through what this new permanent collection installation is going to look like. And we'll get into more details about that later.
Okay, great, thank you. And Sophie?
So I'm the director and chief curator of the Museum of Fine Arts in Nantes, which has reopened after major renovation and expansion project that lasted 6 years, which was very long. And so the museum reopened in 2017, so 2 years ago. The particular situation in which I found myself is twice I arrived as the director of a museum just 1 year before, before it reopened after a renovation and expansion. So I didn't really see any of the preparation decisions. I never went through also the process of choosing an architect. I just arrived before the project was relaunched in its new building and extension. So I guess that's what's maybe interesting for this discussion.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. That gives us a picture, I think, of the variety of projects that we are that can exist. Of course, it's interesting trying to think through all these stories because it's different countries, it's different funding models we were just discussing, it's different timelines on where we're at, but it definitely speaks to people, the difference in all these experiences. Yet there is a commonality, I think, that we can potentially get to in terms of just simply being professionals working through some of these projects, for sure. So maybe I'll just start with a few specific questions for each of you based on your specific roles. So actually, I'll start with you, Paul. As an architect who's worked in and on museum projects such as the one you're currently working on, how have you navigated the needs of the museum staff? Because clearly you have to work sort of with, as even Leah was mentioning, there are staff representatives representing the needs of particular needs of museum objects, and they can be challenging sometimes. So how have you, maybe you can speak to just navigating the needs of museum staff, the art, the museological objects, and then also there's the public. So how do you kind of work in the design phase or whatever with those things?
Yeah, I think the whole process is extremely collaborative, and in many ways it's an educational experience for both parties. I mean, our job is to really get behind the vision behind the curators and the director of the museum to make sure that we're providing the spatial and experiential requirements that are necessary for their vision to be executed. And there are, it kind of ranges. There's a higher, larger, broader view of looking at it in terms of like the philosophy of the spaces and how the directors want their artifacts or art pieces to be exhibited, and there's kind of more zoomed in technical aspects that we would have to accommodate, things such as that are very important, such as lighting, air and humidity control, how big the loading dock is and the sequences for that, things like security. These are all infrastructural elements that really help to make the museum function very well if they're designed well in advance. And those are the kinds of things you kind of don't want to see as part of the experience of the museum. And so the better designed they are, the more invisible they'll be to the eye. And so, but there's a variety of ways, and I think we've worked with people who have different philosophies on how they want their spaces to be designed. Some prefer a lot of natural light, some really don't want it. Some want a lot of flexibilities, and some want a very specific organization of their flow for the experience. And so in particular, in the Korean American Museum, it's a new museum, and it's for an institution that doesn't have a space currently. And so they are actually kind of learning, and we're learning together, and we're having a lot of discussions about what would be appropriate for this museum, given that they don't have a space already and they don't have much of a collection at the moment. And so we're kind of projecting into the future of what a new museum could look like for this community, and the possibilities for that. And so while that leaves some kind of vague questions about some of the specific things we need to design, I think it's been a good process to actually enforce communication between us so that we're making sure we're providing the right infrastructure. And some things can be planned for later, and some things need to be planned for way in advance. So we try to parse that out and prioritize, some things like the AV and IT that are more technology related, in a building project that takes a decade, we would save that for much later in the process. And so sometimes we have to understand that the process is quite a long process, and some things go before others, and that's how we prioritize what's important for the museum.
Right. Yeah, so many questions coming to mind, but yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it's a completely different experience working with, as you said, a building that for a future museum almost, and for the vision of what that's going to be, versus some of us who are going through, we're sort of, in my experience, we're 30 years old, our institution, not very old, but we're in the second revamp, and I'm sure give it 30 more years and there'll be a need for another expansion. I think the recent news about MoMA kind of taking over the block is a good example of a 100-year-old institution and how it moves architecturally with those needs. So being at the very beginning of that would be a unique thing to begin with. So thanks for speaking to that. So I think we'll go to you, Leah, and speak to a bit of the curatorial experience. And so maybe you can talk about how you've navigated pressures of sort of, I know you said that you're 4 years out now, and that you've been on the design committee, and thinking about sort of from the curatorial angle, what things have you been able to bring in, how has that experience been, and how are you even planning now? Maybe speak a bit to the timeline, and how you've been planning for the inaugural opening exhibitions even for 4 years down the road, or what kind of things like that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. What's interesting about this is, again, this is our building is going to be for our permanent historical collection. So, and we're thinking about that under the leadership of our director as an opportunity to remove some of the traditional hierarchies from permanent collection displays, as well as some of the traditional silos. So as it stands now, our direction is to think about how we would display our permanent collection in a way, think of it in terms of narratives, think of it in terms of almost like an exhibition and a story that could change over time and that will change over time. And for example, we aren't dedicating any specific areas to any specific departments. The intention is to display our objects in a way that makes sense to their strengths, and with collaboration and adjacencies that also make sense interdepartmentally, and that after a certain amount of time that may rotate. Obviously, this is with the exception of certain rules and that have been in place by certain donations, but the vast majority of the material can be rotated and can be seen in collaborative ways. So what we've been doing is, in terms of discussions across our curatorial staff, which is rather large, it's 35 to 40 people, including everybody from sort of assistant curator to department head. We've come together both as that big group to think through some overlapping themes, for example, some overlapping topics that we might engage on across multiple departments. But we've also come together just kind of one-on-one in certain occasions to think about, okay, maybe we have one room where it's a kind of nodal point where multiple departments are alongside each other. In this case, XYZ, where that theme may work, just in one gallery as opposed to across, multiple galleries. And then we have a different story alongside of it. So it offers a lot of possibilities. I have to say, it offers also a lot of challenges. It's a huge collection, and it requires us to know, in some ways, the strengths of other departmental collections, which is a kind of an interesting way to look at it, and maybe atypical for a lot of museums. And that's what our first group discussions really helped share, is what the strengths are, or what the interests were, for example, of certain departments and departmental curators in terms of looking deeper into their collections, and therefore people outside of that department could respond in one way or another and think about what they were interested in and what they could share, so that we could look more holistically across the entire collection. I think for us, we're still very far out in terms of thinking about what the entire gallery floor is going to look like. Our building, and we've shared a link with you of some early renderings, but our building really is, the gallery level is kind of suspended on one level. And the entire exhibition floor is one floor of 110-ish thousand square feet of galleries. So we've really tried to think about how, if we have no fixed space, what does this look like? How are we going to negotiate with our neighbors? What are our neighbors going to look like? How is it going to break down? What do our departments need? And these are questions that still are continuing right now. So we haven't gotten to a point where we have been able to lay it out in the galleries yet, also because the galleries are still being finalized on the architectural side. We have a basic idea of what they're going to look like, but in terms of the actual layout, until that's set, we're thinking about this in a more conceptual way.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And I think just the fact that speaking to different phases, sort of not unusual to be working on something like an inaugural exhibition for 4 or 5 years, when you're talking about the big launch and the challenge. In some cases, you're dealing with a permanent collection. We had the additional challenge in our instance about loans involved in a timeline for a building project, which was, I can speak to that later, but that's a whole other kettle of fish.
Right.
But yeah, absolutely some challenges, and thanks for speaking to that. So I think Sandra will go to you now and speak about collections a little bit, because much like Leah, to extent you're dealing with a new display, and I think your project, I would encourage people to check out the link on the chat to see the incredible project that Sandra is heading up, Visible Storage. And so maybe Sandra, you can speak a bit to just, I guess, I keep saying the word navigating, but that's a lot of what the jobs are often, the different needs from different stakeholders. So the safety of objects, also versus the need and new demands for public display, which is kind of the point of the new construction.
Yes, well, maybe if you look at the building, then you see that it's a very spectacular design. It's circular. So when thinking about collection care and safe storage, people usually think in rectangular shapes where you can easily place racks and stands and organize your whole collection. So from the start, this project has been both very challenging but also inspiring in how to present your collection in such a way that it is stored safely and organized in a good manner, so we can work with it as we always do, but on the same side, opening it up to the public. And so from the start, we've been thinking also about how people will be able to see the collection. And to us, it's in a way, it's a totally new way of working, because our staff is used to working behind the scenes. Paul was also mentioning it's all of these rooms you normally do not want to see. Your loading dock, your packing room, your quarantine room. And in our building, everything will be visible. Although to a certain degree, when people will enter, they can either choose to take an elevator and go to the top level where there will be a roof garden. The elevator is transparent, so you see a large atrium going up, and so you see large vitrines carrying collection displays. And so we hope people then think, well, I want to see the building. And then entering the building, they can go up themselves through the atrium staircases, looking into the storerooms, which will be not lit if there's nobody in, but have some sort of spheric lights where you can see the contours of the rooms. And they can take tours, and we're now sort of discussing how to organize it, if we can offer every visitor who buys a ticket a tour. And then you actually go into the storerooms where people from collection management will be working while groups are visiting. So that's quite a new way of working. But it's also very nice, because if you look at the history of the museum, our first storerooms were just 1 or 2 rooms, and the collection grew. And at the moment we have 5 external storage locations, and only, I think, 7% of the total collection of 150,000 objects is visible. So the idea is the collection is owned by the public. So by opening it up, you try and do right to that. But it's not a display. We want to emphasize that it's a working building and not a museum.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine that there's been a lot of staff discussion around the idea of being visible while working.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be its own challenge.
Yeah, our education department also said, or I think marketing, that they were going to name everybody. So here's, my colleague this and that, and she's doing this, and so that's still a debate. I prefer to keep it like, this is a registrar, this is an art handler, and this is the kind of work they do. Yeah. Right.
Has been discussion about like a separate work area where you can escape the public eye. Yeah, no, but it's really interesting how the object, and I mean, this is a ubiquitous issue. I think I could say that it is about, we're constantly being asked by funders and the public, well, how much percentage of your collection is on display at a given time? It is an issue, and I think that your solution is in that building is quite amazing to see, and as well as what you're dealing with, Leah, for the permanent collection, just different ways, new ways of thinking through object display and just making things accessible to people even in a working state, to some, or a stored state. So I think we'll turn to Sophie now, and from the sort of directorial standpoint, that's another whole angle on these kinds of challenges in building projects. And one of the major things as these, we've sort of talked about objects, but there's also, of course, staff and people. And of course, there's a huge variety of sizes of staff and adjustment. But to the point you made in your introduction, Sophie, about coming in after sort of taking on the reins from 2 people who, in 2 different projects where it had been too tiring almost. I mean, this is a reality about staff adjustment. And so maybe you could speak a bit to how you have felt that you tried to achieve helping your staff through this kind of thing, or looking for times of reflection with all the busyness, and how to navigate that?
Yeah, it was kind of a process of kind of adopting a project. You like adopting a child in a way, in its own process of growth. So I was listening carefully to both Leah and Sandra's issues, and it really, of course, echoed with a lot of experience. First, the question of flexibility that Leah mentioned about, changing the way the collections are presented, and being sure that the future can also be able to change the way that things were imagined for the reopening. That's really a key issue, because in both cases there was always this moment when these process of renovating a museum are so long, enormous, complex, that in a way both the architect group, well, in my experience, of course, I cannot speak on a completely general point of view, but in both instances, both the architects groups and the curatorial groups and the staff were completely fixed on a moment, which was the reopening of the museum, and as if that moment would stay then on forever, which is, of course, totally untrue. And so, for instance, the architect in the first museum I directed in Lille, the Modern Art Museum in Lille, all the furniture he had imagined for the permanent collection were totally fixed to the building. They were a part of the building, because in his conception, what's permanent is permanent, what's temporary is temporary. And that, of course, well, will become eventually at one point a problem, because there's no such thing as a permanent collection that's totally permanent. And of course, temporary exhibitions also can be completely the needs and so that's the first aspect, is flexibility is key. And we should resist to this idea that the day one will be the forever. It seems evident, but in both instances, that was a problem in both museums. The second thing that Leah mentioned, and I thought was really interesting, is maybe the staff has to be organized. Maybe there's almost an organizational transformation that has to take place before even the renovation, because in what you were describing, Leah, you're completely rethinking the way the collections will be presented to the public. Then, of course, the way the curatorial teams are working should change as well. And the silos you were mentioning have to be broken up before even the process of renovating the building starts to take place, because otherwise it's going to be maybe a challenge to, bring together a story that is trans technique or trans century, or and this is, of course, I came through that phenomenon is in both museums. When I arrived, there was this kind of dream organization that was related to the reorganization and renovation of the museum, but often it hadn't taken place when I arrived. There was this kind of moment during the renovation where the staff was frozen in a way in its ancient organization. And also the other strange thing is no really written project about the meaning of that renovation had been either written or accepted by the funders. So you arrive the building is finished. The layout of the collections is almost all decided, but the organization in terms of staff is not ready, and nobody really knows what we're going to do with this museum and what's the project and what's the meaning. So it's like the planets are not turning around the sun. And so that's the very strange. And you could think this is, are the French crazy when they plan these things? But I think it happens more often than you think. Is that they think we need more space, we need more staff, we need more exhibitions, we need more storage. But why? Is a question that often is never asked until the end of the project, at least in those two examples that happened, which I thought was strange. So it's true the director has to adopt what has been decided because, of course, you have to, well, museums are stronger and last for much longer than any of us will. So we have to respect that. That's one. And then infuse the idea of flexibility in the staff, that what you have dreamed of will change. What you thought was permanent will not be permanent. Everything's gonna change. So get used to the fact that when the public comes in, all what you imagine will probably move. Just get used to that idea. And of course, the third thing is you have to bring in the meaning. And of course, it's not your meaning. It's what's in the building, what's in the collections, and then pushing that forward toward the future. How can you bring that project? Well, basically find words that will bring the meaning to the future for the staff and the funders. Strangely enough, often lose the meaning of the building because it's so long, the process is so long. It lasted 4 to 5 years in Lille and in Nantes 6 years, which is very long.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. Thanks for speaking to those challenges. I mean, in our case of our building, it was, if you count the years spent from the first feasibility study for a new building, it was 15 years in our case. And the you know, just that's if you really stretch it back, but it was discussions all the way through then. And then you have a new building concretely happening for a good 5 years and construction for 3. But exactly, I mean, if you think about the difference in staff between 15 years, you know, in that kind of period, or even a 5-year period, it's sort of, it's interesting to think about, yeah, the shifting meaning and need for reevaluation. I know in our case, we're 18 months out now, as I mentioned, from our building. And I was just saying that the other day, we're only now, I think, coming into a period where we're really, as a staff, gaining the understanding of the new normal, of what our new sort of strategies are, our regular programming, so to speak. And I think your point about sort of needing to be flexible leads into my next question, maybe for the panelists. And actually, before I jump into that, I'll just remind the participants, the audience, that you can please submit questions anytime. Just type them in and we'll look at incorporating those into our discussion. So don't feel shy to type in a question for any specifically, or for all, whatever you prefer. But my second question, sort of based on the flexibility thing, is about, in my experience with these new builds, that is generally there's this new era of museums being these, and I said the word before, living institutions. So we're looking at, in a sense, what was discussed in the last webinar was community consultation, needing to be accountable to community. This is something that's coming into the discourse of museological practice in a much bigger way in terms of exhibition formation. We can see it concretely in things like object storage display. We are accountable to the community in a way that, in the history of museums, museums were often these teaching institutions that were imposing a narrative or imposing and we're moving far away from that quickly now, and looking at community consultation. And so if we're talking about the buildings themselves, I wanted to ask if some of you, maybe we could go even back to Paul, just start specifically, if there's, have thoughts about how sort of how is a living institution being created, or does this ring true for you in your current project? Are the communal spaces and the public needs of the building and the community, how is that impacting decisions or design, for better or for worse? Just maybe speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a super relevant topic to the project that we're involved with right now. And I think that's kind of one of the key mandates from the museum is to have a flexible space that allows for various types of installation and media, whether it be digital or physical. All those things are kind of asked for in the process. And to a certain degree, it can be in a way limiting to just trying to figure out what we actually need to, where we need to put walls down and things like that. But in other ways, it's actually provided an opportunity for design solutions that are kind of more creative. And so our museum, the Korean American Museum design is centered around actually an outdoor courtyard. We wanted the galleries and communal spaces on the ground floor to be able to open into that. And so by extension, the museum grows by another 2,000 square feet by just opening up the walls for the courtyard. And so that kind of became a conceptual driver for how we organize the spaces to create a flexible environment. And so a lot of the spaces aren't necessarily closed off from each other, but actually open up to this courtyard.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you. It's true. And that in a way speaks to just thinking myself about the digital. We've been talking a lot about sort of as we have sort of more digitization of our experience and people are just more virtually online. Museums like this often provide these face-to-face spaces for people now in the community. And that sounds like that's that experience too. Sophie, would you like to speak to that a little more, to the idea of the communal spaces that come into your project?
Well, interestingly enough, there is always, it's a Beaux-Arts, the main building is a Beaux-Arts building, which was constructed in 1900. And there was this central patio, beautiful with beautiful skylight. And that was conceived initially as a sculpture courtyard, as you can find in a lot of, even in American museums, in 19th century museums. And then across the years, it became the temporary exhibition space, which was a good solution in a way, because it didn't take away permanent collections. I mean, didn't use up the space for that the permanent collections needed. But on the other hand, that space is really a gathering space, and it kind of, there was a big fight between the temporary exhibition architecture and the beautiful, natural architecture, the patio, that in a way looks a little bit like a Chirico painting with beautiful white arcades, very pure. And whereas contemporary artists know how to work with that, when you have a classical type of exhibitions, it's kind of you can feel that both architectures fight with one another. And so the strange thing is they had a huge extension. Now there's a new building next to the palace, and they didn't question that parting of function. And so the new building is for contemporary art collection, and the patio remained the temporary exhibition space. And so just to react to what Paul was saying, I agree with you in saying that I think that museums need a place for gathering that doesn't have any exhibition function, which could be a programming space or a conference space, at least a space that, speaks to what you were saying about the museum being a place where we like to be together and to experience things together. Mm-hmm. So that's what I could talk about is that's strangely enough that wasn't thought through for the museum. And I could also say that they imagined that an auditorium would be necessary. And at first I thought an auditorium was so 20th century because less and less people, like to sit and listen to conferences. I don't know how it is in the States, but symposium and time to gather less people than it used to. And so I thought, this is, you know, this is really old school. This is, since this wasn't really a place that was dedicated to performance or to cinema or movie, it was really dedicated conferences. So, you know, that's the type of things that the city around the museum changes during these 15 years we were mentioning. While the project in its essential elements, we need an auditorium, we need that space of storage, we need that gathering space, we need that many square meters for the permanent collections, that, you know, constantly evolves. And also the city and even the needs, the way the people interact with what a museum is, changes throughout these years.
Yeah,
and so that's but I don't see how you can, you know, you can't ask the architect, well, sorry, we made a mistake, rework totally the project.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I know like one solution in our building, which has been working so far 18 months out very well for us, is essentially a multi-purpose room with retractable seating and a huge screen. So it's like our wedding venue. We have put art in there. We've had film festival, have moved in. And that has been a very malleable, flexible space that we've been so far able to use in that regard. Perhaps Sandra, would you like to speak? I mean, I know your entire thing is meant to be public, sort of communal interactive, but did you have any thoughts on that one? Or
oh, sorry, let me just put on my mic. Well, the building itself is maybe not very designed for gathering, but for walking through the collection, experiencing the collection. On the 6th floor, so the rooftop garden, there is a room where you can gather, but the whole idea is to communicate with your public about the collection. And we did some preparatory projects before the building started to see what this could be like. So we were, for instance, reassessing parts of our collection in order to deciding if we were to de-access or keep the collection. And one of it was our lace collection. And our director was always very critical about the lace collection. Why do we have lace? We have contemporary art, we have old master paintings, why lace? And we did this project where we did, in an exhibition space, unfold all these crates with lace, measure them, take photographs. And none of our curators had specialized knowledge of lace. They did have applied arts, of course, but not particularly all kinds of weaving techniques or datings. So the audience came along with a lot of questions, people being very fond of lace, bringing their own examples. And also an amateur came forward knowing everything about dates and techniques, helping us in finding the right attribution or adding more information. So that to us was a very communal project, and it's the kind of projects we would love to do in the depot, but yeah, it takes time in preparing and using all the results.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting example of, opening up, of course, that makes sense. Opening up the collection to public consumption, even in storage, will bring forward knowledge and community consultation inevitably in possibly surprising ways. And it'll be interesting to see how you can grasp that as an institution. Very interesting. Leah, let's round off this question with you. Any sort of, how do you engage with communal in terms of your plans?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll talk about this in two different ways. I mean, LACMA has a unique, we're in a unique position in Los Angeles because we are a county museum and we have always been a public-private partnership. So we've always had both an obligation and a commitment to our county, which is, for those of you who don't know, about the size of the Netherlands in terms of its geographic scope, and our population is actually 19 million people or so. So we serve a huge amount of people, and we cover theoretically, a huge amount of space in terms of to whom we're obligated, and first and foremost, to share our art with. So there are a couple of things. In the last, as I mentioned, we did our expansion really in the last 10 to 15 years. And in that expansion, we're very much a campus for those of you who haven't visited before. And in the campus itself, we created these public spaces for people to gather. I mean, LA has great weather all the time. And so there are covered outdoor spaces where people can shield themselves from the sun that is relentless most of the time, but also to make it a place that's welcoming. Museums can be very intimidating. Again, our county, we are very much sort of obligated to our county and our county constituents, and they come from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of levels, let's say, of interaction with art and understanding of art and familiarity with art. And it's a way to think about how to maybe break down those barriers of intimidation a little bit, is to have these kinds of spaces, even if they're outside the buildings, technically in our case. In addition, we also have, as we're thinking about our new building and the actual architecture of our new building, we're located on a county park, and the buildings that we're replacing were kind of plunked down in this park, and the park itself didn't really exist. They were kind of paved over in a sort of 1960s typical Los Angeles fashion. And we are elevating the building off of the park so that as I mentioned before, and you can see in the renderings, the exhibition level is held up with kind of these great big pavilions that allow for almost, I think, 4 acres of new public outdoor space underneath it, which will again allow this kind of community gathering space, I think. But the other aspect, on the sort of flip side, if we think about community, and not just in terms of architecture or the actual building itself, but the program that comes with the building, I mean, we, again, our responsibility really is to, and this is more aligned with what Sandra was saying, our obligation is to engage both our art program and our non-art program with the community in some way or another. One of the ways we're thinking about this is, of course, in terms of, move the permanent collection, removing some of those traditional hierarchies and those traditional boundaries. But, another way is we're thinking about, and we have had opportunity to bring our art out into the county for people who can't, so to speak, get to the mothership, because it just is, it's so far away for so many people. And to think about where in terms of offsite we can bring some of our artworks. And that also goes for non-art program. I mean, we provide, and this I know is happening across the board at other museums, but we provide, for example, we provide curriculum because we don't have a lot of art curriculum in our public schools anymore, but we provide art curriculum for LA Unified, which is the second biggest school district in the country. And we bring kids, we have programs to bus kids to LACMA to see the art, but in addition, there are opportunities out in the county to have that. So I think it's a big responsibility. It's sort of baked into LACMA, generally speaking, but I think that just in terms of the relevance to this discussion, these kinds of building projects allow the staff, the administration to focus on these issues and to really prioritize some of these issues over other goals. And what Sophie was saying, one hopes that happens before you begin the building process a little bit. But nevertheless, because these building processes can be so long, you at least have the time to maybe, if you haven't thought about it early on, to think through and sort of prioritize some of these broader and very important issues, because the museums really are an important part to civic life.
That makes sense. And I think one thing I'll just, you were saying yesterday, we had a bit of a pre-discussion, you were saying yesterday was the building project itself propelled the need to move artwork out of storage, just on a logistical level, out of display spaces, out of storage, because of the sort of construction, the dark period, whatnot. And opportunities. These building projects provide opportunities like this that you may or may not have had the impetus to do it to such a great extent before. So that's another interesting aspect of opportunities. So I just want to actually flip to an audience question. Somebody typed in, with your building renovation projects, were additional staff positions added to accommodate larger buildings and programs? And so maybe what those were. I know that just quickly in the case of the Ottawa Art Gallery, we added several staff positions, and we have almost doubled our staff to some extent. If you count suddenly needing frontline staff, we literally didn't need frontline staff before in the same way that we do now. A whole department of visitors experience, but then on the curatorial level, we started to bring in assistant help to some of the learning and engagement and curatorial, where, I mean, our staff is a total of about 40 people-ish total. So we're a much smaller institution than what Leah's describing. Yeah, it certainly propels you to need to fill, and then you have to find the funding to support that. And so that's another whole question of future funding support for increased capacity. But I'll stop talking now and put it over to you. So maybe Sophie, do you want to speak to the staff new position?
Yeah, there's always an expansion of the staff. There's another thing that we were able to do in Nantes, is that since it was closed for 6 years before the museum closed for its renovation process, the guards were public servants on staff, which is not a good idea. And so during those 6 years, they found other missions within Nantes, since it's a city, it's a metropolis museum. So they found other, occupations in different areas of the city services, city departments. And so we were able to outsource the guarding function thanks to that, which works better in my experience for museums. And on the other hand, we of course expanded communication. It's more that the project of the museum, the way the museum envisioned its relationship to its community, completely changed. And so I think the organization mirrors that. So there were more PR people, for instance, a webmaster that the museum didn't have before. Also, somebody in charge of all the software and all the how do you say, the computer projects, or this was a new function to the museum. That's essentially what expanded, and also more in France, we don't have the docents system. So the guides are on staff. So that expanded as well to go with the expansion of the attendance, obviously. So we went from 50 to 60 approximately. Okay. With the guards, without not counting the guards.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sandra or Leah, do you have maybe Sandra?
Well, the thing with us is that we were discussing that for the depot we would be needing additional staff, and in the beginning it was mainly for guards and guides. In the case of opening the public, and not for curators or collection management staff. Although we have argued that it will be necessary because we will be presenting a program there. And we expect to have more work on the collection, also by making it visible, having much more loan traffic possibly. So that's still a topic to debate. But in the meantime, the museum has closed. So a lot of people who are closed, well, we left the building doing all kinds of other projects in the meantime. And now there's really a shift in the work everybody's doing. So it's still a bit something we have to I don't know, decide upon. And at the moment, the staff that has been added is specifically for all the projects to get the whole building project done. So a project manager for the move of the collection, or a project manager to help supervise all the other projects in the building. But in the beginning, it was actually work added to, you know, existing staff. So that has been quite a process to organize it,
Yeah.
and trying to oversee the whole project.
That's,
I suppose when the building reopens, that we will need additional staff, because, you know, operating 2 of these buildings at the same time is quite something else.
yeah, for sure. I think that's a good point about shifting staff roles during the project, for sure, is a really good point to bring up, and wanting to anticipate that, and then moving towards, I know that we began hiring new staff before we opened because of the need to program. So it's like future thinking too, and even before getting into the new building, that new staff can often be required. It seemed to be a good idea in our case, that one. How about you, Leah?
I haven't been on staffing discussions at all, but I can tell you that as far as we are now, we're looking at maintaining our curatorial staff the way it is, and replacing the positions that, you know, for people that change. We're not shrinking by any means, but I can speak to maybe the shifting focus during this time. We remain open. Half of our campus remains open, and the program is pretty rigorous in there. In addition to that, all of the curators have sort of been asked to think about their permanent collection and traveling it in terms of exhibitions that can go out in the world, and so that the material can still be seen out when it can't rotate through those exhibition pavilions that remain open. I think we all wanted some quiet time, if you will, but you know, we have a busy program, and we will carve out time, I know, to get to our permanent collection, also in anticipation of the new installation. And I think the traveling shows also help do that, because they're inward focused. But we still have these responsibilities and these interests to continue the sort of long-term loan projects that we still want to do. So in a way, instead of shifting, maybe we've just we've opened our work more towards the permanent collection, and evaluating the permanent collection, really taking a look at it. There are permanent collection, for example, catalog projects that are in the mix that maybe wouldn't have been beforehand, just because our focus was slightly different. But this goes back to your point of, and Sophie's point of flexibility. We all, you know, change is hard. It's hard, and it's legitimately hard. And there are moments where being flexible is a challenge. But it does, in many ways, if we can put a positive spin on it, really look at it as, even amidst those challenges, to see some sort of opportunity, just like looking at our permanent collection, you know, in maybe more deeper terms and more profound terms than have been allowed or expected in the past. That, you know, the flexibility issue, I see Sophie grinning over there, because I'm sure she's dealing with this change and twice now, it sounds like. We, you know, it's one of those things where we all have to remember and remind ourselves that it is an opportunity to be part of a building project. It seems ubiquitous, but not every curator or director or collections manager actually gets to go through this. And in going through it, there are these opportunities, these wonderful opportunities, even if it comes at the expense of some anxiety from time to time. And to remember that, I think, is very important. I don't mean to sound like, you know, sort of motherly figure to remind everybody this, but it is true. And just, you know, to remember also that everybody collectively is kind of going through this change at your institution, and that, you know, we all have to remember that we're part of a bigger group with bigger goals, and to remember that is to remember that, and to sort of embrace it where we can is very, very important, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice point to bring up. I was going to, I just have, I was going to ask everybody to, I think we would be remiss in this discussion if we didn't sort of do any like advice or lessons learned that you'd like to share, because that's the kind of fun part. But about, oh gosh, didn't think of that, going through the process. So if there's maybe anything, and we have one question from the audience too, maybe I'll try to bring in at the very end, but we have about 6 more minutes. And if any of you panelists would like to speak to something that sticks out for you as like was a particular challenge, or as a particularly interesting anecdote of something you may have been something that would be good advice to share going through this process. Maybe Paul, we'll start with you.
Sure. We kind of talked about this offline a little bit, and I know it's different in different countries, but for the Korean American Museum, and actually for all the museums that we've worked on in America, the funding aspect is kind of been the most challenging part of it, and it has actually required us to revisit how we phase and plan for the building and the construction of the project. In terms of how, for instance, in the Korean American Museum, the land is being leased from the city, and so that's kind of a gift to the museum. And the hope is that after a certain amount of time, that the museum could buy out that property and then do an expansion from there. And so we're thinking about how that could possibly be incorporated into the existing design while still having very limited funds. And so there's kind of this desire to do a lot, and the expectation to provide a lot for the community, because it's a good cause. However, there is this kind of other kind of monster of building up funds so that this can move forward in a timely manner. So I think that is continuing to be something that we're working through.
There's a question right now just being posed actually that feeds into what you're saying. Maybe I can just include it. Is that what makes, from the architectural perspective, makes an effective briefing from a museum client with your process from the museum?
Wow, yeah. So that's. I think that is actually quite essential. Yeah, again, it's a process. It takes time. We're educating each other. However, I think as the ones who are providing the kind of the backdrop for the art, whatever specifics that can be provided in terms of criteria for technical things like lighting, or how many people you're going to be using, or how you plan to use the space for groups or for not. What are some of the sizes, and how do you of the pieces that you're working with? And I think that what helps is when the museum provides, they have a stronger idea of what their vision is. I think when they have the kind of the why that Sophie had mentioned earlier, like why are we doing this? I think that really enforces the design team on the building side to really get behind that, because I think in many ways we can provide solutions that for many different situations and possibilities, but I think we want to be able to make sure that the museum gets what they need out of it. And so I do think, on a more practical level, as much kind of specifics about the technical aspects are extremely helpful. And if there are plans to expand or things like that, what is the kind of desire for that too? Things that we're talking things that take a lot of time, and so those would be very helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. That's great. So we basically have time for 1 more minute for each panel. Leah, what do you think?
Oh, I feel like I already gave my position.
Yeah.
I mean, you need to come back to me in
Sure.
come back to me in 4 years, and then let somebody else talk now, maybe. Yeah.
Sounds good. How about you, Sandra?
I can give just one short example that I came into a play when the briefing was already done for the depot building. But one thing we encountered is that our architect made a very beautiful bowl-shaped building, leaving the ground floor the smallest square meter area, whereas we have the most demand for square meters for public access, for groups, for loading and unloading artworks. So I sometimes wonder, where did we miss that information? And so now we're sort of in the building process. We are making solutions in order to make everything work, but this could have maybe been done better in the briefing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And how about you, Sophie? Oh, you're still muted.
Well, actually, what I could say is maybe a little abstract. It's that it's a birthing process. It's like so the museum is like your dream baby, and it's completely different from the real baby. But the real baby is much more interesting than the dream baby. That's one, because the audience is there. And second, you will get baby blues when it's over. But you will get over it because you'll have new projects to look forward to. But I've seen that, when the whole staff has baby blues and they get, angry and depressed, they don't even know why. It's a big challenge. It's like an exhibition, but multiplied it by 100.
Yeah.
So my advice is think about the real baby and how great it's going to be to see it grow and expand.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice. And maybe Sandra's advice there is always have cats in the office. That makes everything better. We do have one question. We have 2 minutes left, and maybe I'll take the last minute if one panelist wants to jump in on this question from the audience. The question is, have you considered any possible partnerships with other organizations in defining the building, its use, and sharing of expertise to control the costs and strengthen your arguments for supporting the project? So maybe if one of you has a good example of a partnership.
Maybe I can
go ahead. Yes,
jump in. Well, it's a sort of a funding partnership, because we are in order to make it publicly accessible, the foundation, translated it's called the Far Mountains. They offered to give us a large part of the sum needed to make the building publicly accessible, and they will sort of join in the building, having also a few spaces for their own projects. So this idea of the private-public partnerships, because I didn't tell you we are going to rent out some spaces for storage to collectors as well in the building. So the idea was to combine this kind of partnership in order to make the building also financially successful. But we'll see how it works out. It's quite a new idea.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I think there could be many more examples, but I think I'd just like to thank all the panelists for taking the time to speak to this today. I think maybe perhaps one of the major conclusions is that if you're going through a building project and you're out there in the audience, you're not alone. Many of us are going through this, and there's lots of lessons learned, and there's lots of also people out there who've experienced it. So I think I would say, reach out if you ever want to chat to any one of us who have gone through this, for sure. Yeah, thanks for listening today. So I'd just like to thank you, audience, for being here with us today and for signing up to our webinar. Thank the AAMC for supporting this topic, and of course the Terra Foundation for supporting Sarah and Laurence and I and our engagement together. It's wonderful to have a global forum like this, real privilege. And we will look forward. Oh yes, I have to remind you that there was a recording taken of this session, and it will be added to the archive of the AAMC. So if you would like to pass this along to anybody else who you feel would benefit from the conversation, and it'll be available and ready within 1 week. from today. And so we will all, I'm also going to remind the audience that we do have another webinar coming up from the AAMC on Thursday, November 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the topic is Global Topics for Local Audiences. It will explore models and methods for navigating global issues at a local scale, bringing regional, national, or historic art into current international conversations. The registration is now live on the AAMC website, and you can access the speakers lineup and register there at artcurators.org. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are.